Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined on this Monday evening by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
It's really good to be here. Hopefully, I can fill Ash Sarkar's incredibly stylish boots incredibly well today, and you'll be able to look forward to her on Wednesday.
She does have very stylish boots, but no one on YouTube ever gets to see them, so you shouldn't need to worry, and I'm sure you'll be fantastic at filling Ash's boots. She's slightly under the weather, but I'm wishing her all the best. I'm sure you will too in the comments. What have we got coming up tonight? Some very, very interesting stories. DeepSeek. You might not have heard of it before today. If you've turned on the news at all, you will know what it is right now. It's the Chinese version of OpenAI or ChatGPT. Very impressive how it functions, and they've done it at a fraction of the cost. And that has given investors in American tech giants the heebie-jeebies. Massive day on the US stock market. Nvidia, which is the most valuable company in the world, has lost 15% of its value, the equivalent of $500 billion. Yes, there really are companies who can lose $500 billion and still be the most valuable company in the world, which I think that it might be that Apple today has overtaken them again. We'll discuss why that has been the case, why it matters to you guys, why it matters to us all. We'll also, at the end of the show, be discussing the pro-Palestine journalist at Electronic Intifada who has been arrested in Switzerland. Of course, we'll be starting with a sort of really big story from Gaza, which is people returning to their homes in the north. Tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza have begun their return to the north of the Strip following a second exchange of hostages between Israel and Hamas. On Sunday, thousands of people were seen crowding at an Israeli barrier below the Netzarim corridor, waiting for Israeli soldiers to allow them through. That wasn't without violence, though, with Israeli troops accused of opening fire on the crowds, leaving 2 dead and 15 injured. The Netzarim corridor, which runs across the width of the Strip south of Gaza City, has been occupied by Israeli soldiers since early last year. Under the terms of the ceasefire, Israeli troops were supposed to begin withdrawing from the corridor following the exchange of hostages that took place on Saturday. That would allow Palestinians to return north through 2 tightly monitored routes, the Al-Rashid Coastal Road for those travelling on foot, and Salah al-Din Street for those using a vehicle. And at 7 a.m. on Monday morning, Israeli troops finally began to retreat from a part of the corridor along the coastal road, allowing Palestinians travelling on foot to return to the north of the Strip. There were scenes of celebration, with the crowd singing as a chain of people moved through the barrier. For some, it will be the first time they've returned home after 15 months of repeated displacement. Later, troops also withdrew from a segment of the corridor on the inland route, leading to slow-moving queues of vehicles heading north laden with belongings. The freedom to finally move back to the north of the Strip has meant families separated for many months have been able to reunite. Twin brothers Mahmoud and Ibrahim al-Tut found one another in Gaza City after being separated for more than a year, following Ibrahim's displacement to the south, and Mohammed Audi was reunited with his mother, father, and younger brother after the three were displaced to the south 14 months ago. Mohammed described seeing them again as, quote, better than the whole world. And this man found his mother in the north of Gaza months after they were separated when he was forced to flee to the south of the Strip. Around 200,000 Palestinians are now expected to make their way back to whatever is left of their homes in the northern parts of Gaza. Tamir al-Burai, who is still displaced in the south, told Reuters this: a sea of people is waiting for a signal to move back to Gaza City and the north. This is the deal that was signed, isn't it? Many of those people have no idea whether their houses back home are still standing, but they want to go regardless. They want to put up the tents next to the rubble of their houses. They want to feel home. While Palestinians travelling north today will be hoping to begin the process of resuming their lives, the opening of the routes through the Netzarim corridor didn't exactly go seamlessly. On Saturday, Hamas fighters brought 4 women hostages to Palestine Square in Gaza City. IDF soldiers Karina Ariev, Daniela Gilboa, and Nama Levy, all aged 20, along with 19-year-old Liri Albag, were presented on stage where they waved to the crowds before being handed over to Red Cross officials. The 4 women were then driven across the Gaza barricade and into Israel, where they were received by the military before being flown to hospital by helicopter. But Israel delayed the opening of the Netzarim corridor until Monday morning after accusing Hamas of violating the ceasefire. According to the agreement, all women civilian hostages were supposed to be released before military prisoners. But civilian hostage Arbel Yehud, who was scheduled for release on Saturday, remains in captivity, held by Palestinian Islamic Jihad rather than Hamas. The group has now agreed that she will be released on Thursday, along with 2 others ahead of further hostage exchanges next Saturday. The Gaza ceasefire deal guarantees that 50 Palestinian prisoners held by Israel will be released in exchange for each military captive. On Saturday, a total of 200 Palestinian captives were released, with 1,600 returned to Rafah in the Gaza Strip and 70 deported to other mainly Arab countries, all via Egypt. But most of the freed Palestinian prisoners, 114 in total, arrived to jubilant crowds in the West Bank city of Ramallah. Those released ranged in age from just 16 years old to 69-year-old Mohammed Al-Tus. He had been imprisoned for 39 years after being captured in 1985 for fighting Israeli troops. More than half of the 200 released Palestinians had been serving life sentences in Israeli jails. Some had been found guilty of murder, but others were under administrative detention, held prisoner without charge. Now, that release of hundreds of Palestinians brought plenty of reunions across the West Bank and as well as in Gaza. And the opening of the Netzarim corridor today has sparked hope amongst many in Gaza that they will at some point be able to rebuild at least some of what was lost to Israel's assault on the enclave. But all that optimism may be somewhat overshadowed by these words spoken by US President Donald Trump over the weekend.
Looking at the whole Gaza Strip right now, and it's a mess. It's a real mess.
So you'd like Jordan to house people from
I'd
Gaza?
like him to take people. I'd like Egypt to take people. I'm talking to General El-Sisi tomorrow, sometime I believe. And I'd like Egypt to take people, and I'd like Jordan to take people. You're talking about probably 1.5 million people, and we just clean out that whole thing.
That was Donald Trump speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One and pretty clearly calling for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. That's an idea that's also been backed by some in Israel's government. A senior cabinet member has told the Times of Israel that Trump's statement was likely coordinated with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a bid to save his flailing government. That's because the idea of an ethnically cleansed Gaza is likely to appeal to the far-right parties now abandoning Netanyahu over what they see as his weakness over the ceasefire with Hamas. Of course, the voluntary migration of Gazans to Egypt, Jordan, and other countries is something that was tabled right from the beginning of Israel's campaign against the Strip. So I suppose it should be voluntary in quotes like that, because it would, of course, be forced. Israel's Arab allies in the region appear to have shut the idea down, though. Both Jordan and Egypt have rejected the plan, with both countries coming out against any attempt to move Palestinians from their land. And Palestinians are naturally resisting the idea too. Hamas released this statement in response to Trump's suggestion. The Palestinian people, who have stood steadfast in the face of the most heinous acts of genocide in modern times carried out by the fascist Zionist occupation army, have refused to surrender to the crimes of forced displacement, particularly in the northern Gaza Strip. Our people categorically reject any plans for their expulsion and displacement from their land, and we call on the US administration to cease these proposals, which align with Israeli plans and directly contradict the rights and free will of our people. Trump's interventions during the fragile period in which the Gaza ceasefire takes root weren't just limited to words, though. On that same Air Force One flight, Trump was asked this question.
The Pentagon, Mr. President, just lifted a hold on 2,000-pound bombs for Israel, which was blocked by Biden. Do you have a comment on that, sir?
On the what?
On the 2,000-pound bombs that Biden had put a hold on?
We released them.
Yeah.
We released them today, and they'll have them, and they paid for them, and they've been waiting for them for a long time. They've been in storage for a long time, but we released them today to Israel.
That announcement prompted this response from Netanyahu.
Thank you, President Trump, for keeping your promise to give Israel the tools it needs to defend itself, to confront our common enemies, and to secure a future of peace and prosperity.
So we've got the two sides of Donald Trump. I mean, there's many sides to Donald Trump's presidency, isn't there? But when it comes to the Middle East, it does seem to be Donald Trump who forced Israel's hand and finally got the ceasefire that Joe Biden failed to secure. At the same time, Joe Biden is very willing to sort of publicly repeat the maximalist demands of the Israeli far right and Netanyahu's desires, of course. Helena, it's interesting here because, in a way, I think also the Biden administration were willing to sort of consider this idea of so-called voluntary. I mean, basically the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, right? Pushing people out to different countries. The thing that's always blocked that happening isn't liberals in Washington. It's the fact that Jordan and Egypt won't take anyone because, one, they think that would be acquiescing to a campaign of ethnic cleansing, and I think probably most significantly, they think it would destabilize their own countries.
Yeah, so I fully think that that is probably an unlikely situation to happen in a kind of peaceful manner. As you say, I don't think you would ever get the leadership of any of these Arab countries that neighboring Israel to acquiesce to even essentially even more Palestinian refugees. You've got to remember there are already, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees in these countries already, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, places like that. This would be an extra thing that these governments would actually have to spend a lot of their time and have a lot of their money, which their own citizens wouldn't want to have. Despite a lot of these countries around Israel have essentially at this point committed to the normalization of diplomatically with Israel. The idea of them having to deal personally, individually, with what that would do to their own country, I think is the sticking point there. I think we've for a long time seen that a lot of these countries really have abandoned the Palestinian cause kind of centrally, but they're doing what's best for them. So I think you're right that those things wouldn't happen with these countries saying so. Of course, what that doesn't do is rule out the idea of future military action being used to essentially quote unquote finish the job. Now you can't really do that with your hostages still in the area. So back to your points that you were making kind of last week about this idea of, well, the ceasefire is time to normalize getting the hostages out, have a lull in the fighting so that Israel can regroup, and then sometime they'll go later once their hostages have been removed from the area through the ceasefire deal and the prisoner exchanges. Then that might be a time when the military might is so strong, given that they've now been given a carte blanche in terms of the weapons they now have access to and all the extra funding that they get from Trump, even more so than Biden administration. It's clear from the statements that we've heard from Donald Trump that he isn't against the idea of the waterfront properties in Gaza, and he's spoken quite clearly about the fact that would be a possibility. So the idea that that might not happen in the future, I think we can't really make firm and fast predictions thus far. But what we can know is that this will come against the will of countries neighboring Israel rather than with their permission. If they do create 2 million refugees overnight, should they do such a thing? One thing that would, I think, lend me towards the idea of this conflict continuing further after the ceasefire deal has been gone through to the point where all the hostages have been returned and there's been a prisoner exchange that's been done. One thing I would say is that the whole point of hostage taking, and that has been for a very long time with regards to Palestinian resistance forces, is that this has been something they have shown to work in terms of getting prisoner swaps. We all remember what happened with Gilad Shalit all of those years ago, and it led to a giant prisoner exchange. And this was quite widely believed to have given the Hamas Politburo the idea that, well, this is something that we should be doing more often. It's clearly a successful strategy in terms of dealing with the fact that there are loads of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails with no charges being held and detained without trial. So if that is going to be the continuing status quo, then that both that time with Gilad Shalit has given them the incentive to do so, and even after we've seen everything here, they've managed to get to the point where they actually do the prisoner swap. And we all know that Netanyahu doesn't actually want to do this. It's why he was waiting for so long and had to be forced by the Trump potential deal. We don't know what's going on in the background to actually acquiesce to a ceasefire deal as a kind of last resort. So the idea that once the hostages have been taken out, because remember, a lot of these Palestinian prisoners that have been released, they'll probably just end up in Israeli jails anyway. This has been something that's happened all the time, even with people who were given release during the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange. A lot of these people just ended up back in Israeli jails anyway because they are occupying forces in the West Bank. If they want to black bag people off the streets and throw them in jail with no charge and no trial, they can just do that, whether they're a previously released prisoner or not. They have the power to be able to do that in future if they want to. It's whether or not that they get the go-ahead from America and the international community, and that is something that they are more likely to do now that we have Donald Trump essentially having cancelled loads of other international aid. Because remember that one of the first things he came to government doing was, we're going to slash all of this spending from the state. There's going to be the Department of Government Efficiency. We're going to remove all of this funding. And one of his first things that he did was say, well, we're going to cancel all international aid except for Israel. There's always that one exception, isn't there? And all the America First people going, well, we're going to put money for Americans first. We're going to be the America First party. Well, turns out still the Israel First party at this point, and that's where American taxpayers' money is going. It's going to give Israel even more military aid, even after the ceasefire.
I suppose you might still say that, because obviously Trump is willing to say stuff that Biden wouldn't have been willing to say. So Biden, I don't think ever did say. I mean, there was lots of sort of reporting from behind the scenes that sort of his team fought the idea of, neighboring countries taking on the population of Gaza would be a good idea, and then that was sort of kiboshed when the Egyptians and the Jordanians, as they have now, said absolutely not. Right. So, but Biden wouldn't have said it publicly. A big difference with Trump is he will say it. He will say that he is in favor of these demands that sort of kind of everyone considers acceptable. But then I suppose you could say if what you care about is consequences, then talking a good talk and putting no pressure on Israel, which is what Joe Biden did, versus actually getting a ceasefire and verbally saying some outrageous things, maybe you would go with the latter. Although, of course, the 2,000-pound bombs, that is material. That will have sort of material physical consequences. And yes, it's obviously very unpredictable what happens with Donald Trump. I mean, it's interesting, sort of you said there, they won't necessarily be able to push these people out, but maybe they can still finish the job in terms of starting bombing again. I do think this is sort of the fundamental issue of where I don't see where this is going, because, I think there is a genocidal war that's happened, but I don't think Israel is going to be able to kill 2 million Palestinians, right? I don't think the world will accept that, actually, a sort of second Holocaust, essentially. So I think their plan has been, what we do is we make it unlivable in Gaza and then sort of ramp up the sort of pressure on other countries to accept these people, to say, well, they've got nowhere to live. We had to destroy it because of Hamas. I mean, they clearly can't live here. You're going to have to let them go to your countries. Egypt and Jordan just keep saying no for very understandable reasons. I think they think that, if they accept 1 million or so Palestinians, lots of those Palestinians will still have lots of sort of desire to have a free, independent Palestine. They'll blame that government for sort of acquiescing with Israel, and then you'll have a lot of domestic instability. There's already sort of somewhat fragile countries anyway, so I can see why they're not doing it. But that does mean we're sort of in this horrible stalemate where Netanyahu has an interest in making the people of Gaza not flourish, not properly rebuild. No one wants to sort of let these people come to their countries. Not that necessarily the people want to leave Gaza, right? You saw all of those people move back to their homes in northern Gaza, which are destroyed. Loads and loads of people care really, passionately about staying in Gaza because they care about the country and the land. But, all people are just stuck in limbo, right? This sort of hellish limbo where they can't go anywhere else, but they're also not allowed to sort of flourish where they are. And I just don't see where it's going to go. That's why it's such a depressing situation. A week after American tech oligarchs flaunted their access to the White House, we might have expected their share prices to be on a high. And as the bosses of Meta, OpenAI, and Google lined up with the new president, these looked like companies that weren't just at the cutting edge of technology, but which could rely on the favor of the most powerful political office on the planet. However, it's not looking so rosy in Silicon Valley today, as Wall Street tech stocks look set to lose $1 trillion in value. Yes, $1 trillion in value. The crisis of confidence in the American tech giants has been caused by a Chinese startup called DeepSeek. Last Monday, the company released a new AI reasoning model called R1, which gives comparable results to OpenAI's ChatGPT, but at a fraction of the cost. DeepSeek say it spent only $7.5 million on the new service. Now, this is a huge threat to the American companies, not just because it shows Chinese firms can be more efficient, but more significantly because it's a massive challenge to the entire American model of AI leadership. So the likes of OpenAI, Google, and Meta have up to now been working according to an intellectual framework which assumes the power of an AI system is a reflection of the sort of quantity and quality of the chips they are using. So the number of advanced silicon chips it has access to. In short, the more chips you buy, the more data you can train your AI models on, and the more data you can train your models on, the more useful, the more powerful they will be. Now, this is the theory that led NVIDIA, a chip-making firm, to become the world's most valuable company. And it's therefore no surprise that NVIDIA was the company hardest hit today. Its stocks are down 15%, knocking $465 billion off its value. And that's the biggest absolute drop in the value of a company in stock market history. It was also that theory that more chips equal better AI that was behind the announcement of a supposed $500 billion investment in AI infrastructure at the White House last week. That deal, announced by Trump, was between OpenAI, SoftBank, and Oracle. But even before Trump, the idea that advanced chips meant better AI, or more chips meant better AI, also determined policy in Joe Biden's White House. His administration was determined to protect the US advantage in artificial intelligence, and to that end had implemented sweeping export controls on the most advanced chips to China. But some now argue that has backfired. In the Financial Times over the weekend, law professor Angela Zhang argued that far from stymieing progress, export controls simply force Chinese companies to be more innovative than they otherwise would have been. And perhaps the most obvious sign of China's challenge to American AI dominance can be found on the Apple App Store. So DeepSeek Assistant is currently the most downloaded app on Apple, overtaking, you can see there, ChatGPT. I'm not quite sure why Paramount Television is number 3, but I suppose being number 1 in the App Store doesn't actually mean you're the most popular app. It just means that people are downloading you more, right? You can see there that Blue Sky and Threads were much higher than X. Lots more people have X, but people aren't really downloading X because they already have it. But still, very, very significant. So how significant is the rise of DeepSeek, and why should you all care? Why does it matter? To get the latest on the hype around the company, I spoke to tech journalist James Vincent, and I began by asking what DeepSeek's new model actually does.
There are two things there. There is DeepSeek, the model, and then there is DeepSeek, the company. So DeepSeek, the model, is it's a large language model, it's like ChatGPT. It's one of these systems that has been trained on a large amount of texts, and then it responds to your questions. To be a little bit more specific, it's what we would call a reasoning model, which means that it's been fine-tuned. It's been getting some extra sort of testing, training, and data in order to make it better at thinking through questions that involve maths or that involve reasoning in some way. It usually does that by talking to itself. So it says, if I was to answer this question properly, what would be the best way to go about it? And then it goes through that process. Now, this is very similar to OpenAI's O1 and O3 models, which are their most recent releases and are accessible through ChatGPT. So that's what DeepSeek, the model, is. And then there's DeepSeek, the company. So DeepSeek, the company, was founded in 2023, and it is a subsidiary of a Chinese hedge fund called High Flyer that was founded in 2015. Now, High Flyer, the story behind that is that this was a quant firm, one that analyzed financial data. They had a bunch of computing power, a bunch of GPUs left over. And so the founder, out of a sense of sort of scientific curiosity, as he's put it in interviews, said, why don't we make an AI company just for the fun of it? And what he did is he went to Chinese universities and he got all the sort of top flying PhD students and said, don't you want to build something incredible? And he said that it's a sort of high risk, high investment, low profit system. So it's very similar to how OpenAI started out, quite an idealistic approach to AI and technology.
On an even more basic level in terms of what it does. So when I speak to people who are very skeptical that AI matters, I think an issue is, and I'm the same here, when I use ChatGPT, I'm using it kind of as a search engine, right? Or kind of like a chatbot. It feels a little bit like speaking to, a chatbot in customer services. And if that's, your only sort of contact with ChatGPT, it can seem like, what is all this fuss about? How is this glorified search engine going to transform the economy? So, but are there examples of people who are using this in a more, I suppose, profound way, or in a way that does seem more transformational?
I think that's a really, really good question, because you're right. If you just think of ChatGPT and these AI systems as search engines, you don't understand necessarily why people are getting so exercised about them. If you look to how these systems are being used, particularly in Silicon Valley, and this comes with a lot of caveats, but people are using these as sort of intellectual companions in some way. A lot of things that people do with them is they go, right, I've got an idea for this product or this website. How do I build that? They ask these systems questions, and then they get guidance from them about how to go forward with a particular project. So the people who really believe in these, and I'm not saying, I'm necessarily on board with all the hype, but the people who do really believe in them, they see these not simply as a better search engine, but something more like having an endlessly patient, very intellectually curious friend who's going to help you through all these projects, who can answer these questions for you. Again, whether or not these systems actually fulfill that promise is a very subjective and difficult to answer thing. Sometimes they do, and most of the time I don't think they do. But for a lot of people who are using these, they see these as really powerful tools and much more than search engines.
The key thing here, because as far as I understand, DeepSeek hasn't created anything more powerful than anything that's been created before. It's not like, oh wow, this is showing us that AI can do something we didn't realize it could do. The issue here is that they've done it on the cheap. In fact, they've said they spent only £7.5 million on the new service compared to the tens of billions that the other companies have spent. That's what's significant here. Can you talk about that or make sense of that to us? How can it be the case that they did this on such a shoestring?
I think one of the reasons is that American companies have become really invested in this approach to building AI systems. They have told themselves again and again that this is the way we do it. And I think in a way that has intellectually foreclosed them to other approaches. And, necessity is the mother of invention, right? And when America imposed export controls on Chinese AI phones, one of the things they've done is force them to take a different approach to these systems. I think when we're thinking about how AI is developing at the moment, we really are at the start of a new field, right? There is just so much space to explore. There is just so many possible avenues that people can take. And all of these avenues, to some degree, are bringing in progress. They are bringing in dividends. So we shouldn't be surprised that this company from China has gone, what if we just went this route instead? And they found a lot of profit from doing so. So I don't think it's really this case that, there's something different in the water in China that is letting people drink, that is letting people create these models. It's just that there's lots of progress to be made.
There's lots about this story which, it seems in a way heartening. It's open source. I like open source technology. It's sort of giving a bit of a bloody nose to the tech giants, and it's sort of showing that you can get great outcomes on a shoestring instead of with hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time, on this show we talked about AI safety, the idea that there's loads of scientists, Geoffrey Hinton at Google, or formerly of Google, one of them, who was sort of saying, we're moving way too fast with this. We need to radically slow down. Now, this story to me seems like this is it speeding up, right? Not for one reason, which is that more people can do this, but then also, if there was any sort of sense in Silicon Valley that, guys, we've got time here, we can slow down, we'll keep the lead, it doesn't matter. They're going to be racing to go as fast as they can. The Chinese are going to be racing to go as fast as they can. Do we have a bit of an arms race with AI, and what could be the consequences of that?
You're absolutely right, unfortunately. One thing I would say is that this arms race was already locked in before the announcement of R1. It was sort of already locked in well with the end of the Biden presidency, and really consolidated by Trump getting in. One of Trump's main political tools has been threats, has been saying that China is this great competitor of the US. And as soon as he was elected president, we knew there was going to be an increase in the race dynamics, because that has been the rhetoric he's deployed. Beating China is important. And as we saw in the inauguration and him hugging close all these tech leaders, he's going to make the success of American tech companies something that is, if he can, dependent upon his political success as well. He's going to tie their fortunes together. So I think regardless of R1 being released, the race dynamics were always going to increase under a Trump presidency. Is this bad for AI safety? Yes, basically. I can't see, as I said, some people do argue that, hey, you have more access to these models. People get to test them. They get to work out how to make them safer. But I think the only conclusion to take is that if more people have access to more powerful models that are potentially dangerous, then more people have access to them. This just makes that more difficult. I think the bigger question of AI safety, I'm not what some people would call an AI doomer. I'm not hugely worried about super intelligent AI. I am worried about how AI is going to be used by companies and by people around the world. I don't think the release of R1 hugely changes that, but it definitely does increase these race dynamics.
There are also sort of deep social implications, which could be positive or negative, depending on how you look at it, or I suppose depending on what happens, right? It's going to be an open question. And a clip went viral over the weekend. It's actually from early last year, but sort of lots of people seem to have just noticed it, including myself. It's of OpenAI CEO Sam Altman.
I still expect, although I don't know what, and this is over a long period of time. This is not a like next year or, the year after that kind of thing. But over a long period of time, I still expect that there will be some change required to the social contract, given how powerful we expect this technology to be. I'm not a believer that there won't be any jobs. I think we always find new things to do. But I do think like the whole structure of society itself will, be up for some degree of debate and reconfiguration.
Now, that clip went viral mainly because people felt affronted that you had this sort of Silicon Valley billionaire demanding the rest of us rewrite the entire social contract just so his company can grow. Right? It seems a little bit obnoxious. It is worth pointing out, though, looking into this yesterday, Altman's stated vision for a new social contract on the surface doesn't actually look that bad. So in 2021, he wrote sort of something that looks a bit like a manifesto called Moore's Law for Everything. It's up on the internet. It opens like this. My work at OpenAI reminds me every day about the magnitude of the socioeconomic change that is coming sooner than most people believe. Software that can think and learn will do more and more of the work that people now do. Even more power will shift from labor to capital. If public policy doesn't adapt accordingly, most people will end up worse off than they are today. We need to design a system that embraces this technological future and taxes the assets that will make up most of the value in that world, companies and land, in order to fairly distribute some of the coming wealth. Doing so can make the society of the future much less divisive and enable everyone to participate in its gains. And then later in the piece, he says this: as AI produces the world's basic goods and services, people will be freed up to spend more time with people they care about, care for people, appreciate art and nature, or work towards social good. We should therefore focus on taxing capital rather than labor, and we should use these taxes as an opportunity to directly distribute ownership and wealth to citizens. In other words, the best way to improve capitalism is to enable everyone to benefit from it directly as an equity owner. Right? So according to this piece, Altman wants robots to do all the work, and he wants the public to have shared ownership of those robots so they can share in the rewards. So it's not too far from fully automated luxury communism. James, I want your thoughts on this. Is Sam Altman one of the good guys?
I think what you've told me about his vision here, it does sound very nice, doesn't it? Robots doing all the work, us having control over the robots. It sounds lovely. I think Sam Altman is a very good rhetorician, and he's good at conjuring up visions that appeal to his investors as much as the general public. I think when you look at Sam Altman and you want to know how the future might go under his control, it is better to look at his actions than it is to read his words. And I think he has shown that what he's very good at so far is moving power towards his personal control. The history of OpenAI is a really interesting example of this. Obviously, it was founded as a non-profit. It was founded to have this structure, so whatever it developed would be, given to the benefit of all humankind. What Sam Altman has done has turned it into a for-profit company under the control of Sam Altman. I think if you're trying to judge, the veracity of his words and whether you want to, follow his commands and his directions, think about what he has done with the power that's been given him so far. I find it hard to say whether or not he believes in this stuff or not. Maybe he really does, and maybe he thinks everything will be better after the revolution. But in the run-up to the revolution, I think you can see what's happening already.
That was James Vincent speaking to me earlier today. He was making the case that we shouldn't trust Sam Altman with our futures. I think it was fairly convincing. I don't think Sam Altman's behavior necessarily accords with the statement we read there. There's a great clip, isn't there, of Joe Rogan. I think with Elon Musk sort of laughing about this clip of Sam Altman in kind of a $1 million car. So he clearly is someone who cares about accruing wealth and power, not just about sharing it out. It's also worth noting, though, we shouldn't trust the Silicon Valley tech billionaires. We probably also shouldn't put too much trust in the Chinese government. Amid the buzz about DeepSeek, lots of people have commented on how there are certain issues it can't help you with. And when I had a go today, this is me screenshotting a conversation with DeepSeek. What happened at Tiananmen Square in 1989? It says, sorry, that's beyond my scope. Let's talk about something else. So I ask what happened in Berlin in 1989. And he can give me a nice, long answer. There were peaceful protests. There was a mass exodus. There were demonstrations, the resignation of Honecker. And then I ask, it seems like there's an inconsistency between what you'll say about Germany and what you'll say about China. Why? And it tells me the differences in how, oh, sorry, that's beyond my scope. Let's talk about something else. So you saw there, it started answering the question and then it deletes its own answer. I asked, why is that beyond your scope? Tells me again something about Berlin. But why are events in Berlin in your training data, but not significant events in Beijing? That's my question, like Tiananmen Square. And they start giving me an answer, which is sort of quite long and detailed. And then, sorry, that's beyond my current scope. Let's talk about something else. And then I ask it about the Uyghurs in China. Are they repressed? Again, it starts giving me an answer, quite a complicated one. Human rights abuses, tells me the Chinese government's stance. It actually sort of talked about some, the detentions and the like, which I thought was quite surprising. I wasn't expecting it to give me this, but oh, there we go, within a second. Sorry, that's beyond my current scope. Let's talk about something else. It's worth noting, and that doesn't necessarily mean, this story, the idea that sort of if you've got some positive visions about DeepSeek, it's always going to be controlled by the Chinese government. Because I suppose the interesting thing with DeepSeek is the technology is open source. So people can use that open source technology and not give it the same guardrails that you have to give it if you're a Chinese company, presumably close to the CCP. Helena, your thoughts on DeepSeek? Should we care that it seems to be censored in line with the priorities of the Chinese government? Should we nonetheless celebrate the challenge to Sam Altman and the Silicon Valley oligarchs?
I mean, I'm always glad to see the American oligarchs take a bit bloody nose now and again. I'm not gonna disparage that. And as you say, it being open source is a real kind of game changer. Or to be fair, it is the internal code that is open source, but the training data, I believe, isn't open source. So that's specific what you get with using R1, all that training data, that is held behind by DeepSeek, whereas it's the code for creating the model. So there's some push and pull there. And I think what you actually see that's kind of common in between what you hear from Sam Altman on what he's done so far and what you see from DeepSeek and the control by the Chinese government is that the whole point of AI, the whole problem, the kind of real crux of discourse is about ownership. And in that little kind of missive that you saw from Sam Altman, I think he was correct in saying that there's going to be ownership of capital in an AI economy is where everything is going to lie. And if you don't tax capital enough, all of the extra productivity that you'll get from AI, it will all filter upwards. It will all filter into the hands of the very few who own the things doing the stuff. When capital has far surpassed labor as being the most important part of the economy. I mean, of course, later down the line, it will all count as like total value productivity, but that's going to be really difficult to quantify. But either way, as long as if you tax the capital, then I guess I understand where he's coming from. But of course, that doesn't change over the control about what the model does. That doesn't change the control over not just like the financial aspect, but also like the societal aspect of it as well. And that's what's happening, as you see, when the Chinese government have so much control over what's happening with regards to what DeepSeek will or won't talk about in terms of their own internal laws with what their little partner companies will do. And where Sam Altman goes wrong, I think, in the statements that he made, is that we saw the trial of kind of mutually owned capitalism fail under Margaret Thatcher, right? So the idea, like probably a noble idea under Thatcher, was that we'll create a shareholder democracy. People will have investment in society. They'll get returns from the gains of society. Even if we can't get rid of the greed of the marketplace, we can ensure that people get returns on that because they will all own somewhat of it by having access to the shares. Without realizing, of course, is that if you have an open market for goods and services and commodities, you also have an open market for shares as well. And the dynamic of market economies in terms of how people purchase within them is that the people who have all of the money get to have the best bargaining power over who gets access to those commodities and resources. So if you just say like, oh, well, you just have the shares open and people can be shareholders as part of this kind of big project where AI is shared amongst everybody, well, that just means that the people at the top already had the finances and already had the money will just end up being able to buy everybody out of whatever they had as access to that shareholder democracy. And you end up with what we have now. You end up with what you have now, where a certain small clique of people, they control all the finances, they control the politicians, they control huge aspect of the societal nature of where we live, so much so that they can just get in bed with a different politician and immediately their societal opinions change like that. Because it is about access to power, it is about access to money. So, of course, the only way that you can have a proper guardrail over this is to have it owned in common by the state. Rather than just say, well, there should be shares that can be bought by anyone else, and that might filter up later into the hands of the rich, which it usually does. If the state is in control, that is the biggest guardrail against the power of capital. I mean, Gary Stevenson talks about this a lot, in which we've come to fear the role of the state in the modern age, when really, like, that is the last bulwark of defense of the people against the corporations. And if we continually allow our states to get cucked out to mega corporations, we'll end up with what we're seeing in America, with Donald Trump getting into bed with the AI tech giants. But of course, the other side of the problem is that if your government isn't democratically accountable, like it isn't in China, they can choose what information you can have access to. They will choose how the technology is used as well. So I think that the real solution to this is some level of state ownership, a large state stake in the gains of AI that can be used to fund public programs and welfare programs, and like the social contract would change towards back to what it used to be, where the state involvement would therefore give you returns as a citizen, free at the point of use as a collective effort. But there has to be the stabilization of a proper and real democracy in terms of how people participate in the state. And that is something that we have very little of in our country at the moment, too. So those are the things that we will need to fix. In my mind, if we want to make AI work for everybody, share those gains and create a world where we might have to do quite a lot less work than we do now. But that will only happen if those gains are spread to the people rather than to the elites. And at the moment, I don't really see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Sam Altman's vision, well, his vision that he wrote down, I mean, as has already been suggested, it's not necessarily what he really wants. His behavior doesn't necessarily suggest this is what he really wants. But the vision as it's written down, I suppose the idea isn't really to dramatically change power relations. It's sort of to say, under a capitalist system, which he says he's very much in favor of, sort of the fact that capitalists need workers gives workers a certain amount of power, if not so much, well, some political power, but also power just to demand some of the product, right? Because if they need you to work, you have to pay them a wage. If you have a situation whereby you don't really need labor much anymore because it can all be made, it can all be automated, not just the physical stuff, but also the intellectual stuff, and workers become somewhat redundant, you have a situation whereby loads of people have no real claim on the product of society. And so I think he's suggesting something along the lines of, I mean, it's kind of a UBI, but basically instead of getting an income, you get the shares, and then the shares will obviously have sort of annual dividends. So it's not, it's probably better than the more likely future with AI, which is just that we have the AI giants, they monopolize the industry, loads of people get fired and end up, unemployed, and on maybe measly benefits or none at all. Like, his vision is probably better than what we're going to get. Maybe, I mean, hopefully not. Let's be optimistic. Let's say that we can not just wrestle the profits away, but we can also wrestle the political power. But yeah, he doesn't seem too interested in the political power, which makes it difficult to see how you would get that sort of distribution of those shares, because who has the power to demand that? I suppose maybe he's trying to say, well, if you let me be the AI God King, I will be a benevolent AI God King, which I'd like to believe, but I'm not sure I have much reason to. The Electronic Intifada is an online news site dedicated to covering the Palestinian struggle against Israeli occupation. Founded 24 years ago, it has provided an independent Palestinian perspective on conflicts in the West Bank and Gaza. And during Israel's most recent genocidal assault on Gaza, it has frequently printed reports from those in the enclave, as well as analysis and journalism that challenges the mainstream narrative. But now it looks like it might be being punished for it. Electronic Intifada co-founder and executive director Ali Abunimah has been arrested by the authorities in Switzerland after he arrived in the country to speak at an event in Zurich on Saturday. Abunimah, who is an American citizen, is reportedly being held under suspicion of violating a Swiss entry ban, justifying the decision to arrest him, or attempting to justify the decision to arrest him. The head of Zurich's Department for Security said this: "We do not want an Islamist Jew hater who calls for violence in Switzerland." Plenty of prominent people, however, don't recognize that description of Abunimah. Irene Khan, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Opinion, said this: shocking news, Switzerland is a member of Freedom Online Coalition. I urge to urgently investigate and release Ali Abaniba of Electronic Intifada. This was UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese. So she said this: I share the shock and urge for a prompt investigation into this matter. The climate surrounding freedom of speech in Europe is becoming increasingly toxic, and we should all be concerned. This was the reaction of activist and journalist Aaron Mate, who received the news of Abanima's arrest while speaking at a Palestine event in Toronto.
Very upset to hear that Ali's been detained. I'm not surprised, though, because Ali's been at the forefront of calling out the complicity of European states in the genocide in Gaza. And so the fact that he's being arrested now in Zurich is not surprising. Also following so many other crackdowns in Europe. Like, what is it about Europe deciding to carry on the Nazi tradition in the service of today's Nazis? So I'm reminded of that doctor from Gaza. I'm sorry his name escapes me, but the very well-known one who went recently to try to... Yes, who was arrested, or was prevented from entering the country to deliver lectures that he was invited to. I mean, this is the face of Europe right now. It's so abhorrent. And so, free Ali Abunimah.
Mate is right about the clampdown on those who assert the right of Palestinians to resist occupation. Prominent Palestinian surgeon Ghassan Abu Sitta was detained and then expelled from Germany in April last year after travelling to the country to speak at a conference. A month later, he was denied entry to France after he was invited to speak at the country's Senate and told that a Schengen travel ban had been placed on him by Germany. And last year, British authorities arrested several journalists under the Terrorism Act, including Electronic Intifada contributor Asa Winstanley. And yet, while journalist Ali Abunimah is treated like a criminal by the Swiss authorities, the country seems pretty welcoming of those who've overseen a genocide. This was Israeli President Isaac Herzog speaking at the World Economic Forum's annual conference in Davos this week. He, of course, escaped Switzerland consequence-free. That's despite the fact that while Herzog mingled with billionaires in the luxury ski resort, the Swiss Attorney General received several criminal complaints against Herzog, accusing the president of inciting genocide. Helena, this seems pretty shocking, doesn't it? I mean, because I think also they gave this guy permission to speak in Switzerland and then arrested him there, which, I mean, it'd be shocking however they did it, but I mean, it's pretty awful.
Well, what's that you can hear? What's that you can hear, by the way? Oh, that's the total silence of the right-wing free speech brigade on this one. Complete radio silence in terms of genuine repression of free speech. The state cracking down on people for voicing their support of Palestinians, for making arguments in favor of Palestinian resistance to occupation. The Free Speech Brigade, totally silent on this. They're too busy talking about people having their Twitter accounts deleted for violating the terms of service, or that, I guess that's not really a thing nowadays in the world of Elon Musk. Although, to be fair, you can't say cisgender on Twitter anyway. So that is beyond the point. Anyway, it's just, I find this level of hypocrisy that you see in that free speech is an important cornerstone of a lot of our societies. And in terms of political speech, that is something that is extra important that we keep being free. And the crux of where free speech legislation comes in is that it's about the state repression of you. It's about and the forces of the state being brought down upon you for the things that you say and the opinions that you express. Whilst loads of people on the right would be absolutely up in arms about someone being quite supposedly cancelled for saying something, which is a social opinion. I've seen very little coverage from these supposed free speech warriors about what's happening to people time and time and time again, who having their freedoms taken away from them simply because they are pro-Palestine, simply because they support what is, again, as shown as the duty of people under international, which is to be able to resist occupation. These aren't people who have expressed support for terrorist groups themselves. These aren't people who've said that I explicitly support XYZ terrorist group, which is illegal. That is an illegal thing for you to be able to do, especially in the EU, where there are even more prescribed groups there than there are in the UK. That's not what these people have done. They have made dispassionate descriptions of things that have happened within the territories in Palestine. This is something that they've done, they've consistently reported on, doing actual real journalism. But because they have opinions that are outside, like the acceptable kind of the imperial core groupthink and what is allowed to be an acceptable opinion, suddenly those free speech rules go out the window, and indeed the supposed warriors for free speech immediately avert their eyes and they refuse to comment on such things. When, of course, they have got plenty of denouncements for broad support for Palestine. In fact, this has been something I've seen from a lot of these free speech types, quote unquote, is that they're overriding sense is that actually we shouldn't be having pro-Palestine protests. These are hate marches, for example. We should be cracking down on the rights of people to protest, which is free expression within a democracy. So again, there may be obviously plenty of outliers to this, but this is a broad trend that I have personally noticed, that you don't ever see this level of defense for what is state crackdown on people's genuinely held opinions, and especially ones in which might implicate especially European states in being supportive of, international war crimes committed by Israel, or the EU's diplomatic backing for the continued decades-long occupation, illegal occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and of Palestine in general. It's interesting how as soon as your opinions are outside of Western policy groupthink, suddenly states are very happy to crack down on your opinions.
I mean, this is personally why I think the situation whereby being seen to support a militant group, a militant resistance group in another country is illegal. Like I don't like Hamas, right? I also don't like the IDF. But in this country, you can say yay IDF and you can't say yay Hamas. And that to me seems, that doesn't seem logical, right? Well, it seems logical if what you want to do is sort of put the weight on the scales in favor of Israel when it comes to sort of public discourse and reporting. But the idea, I mean, Hezbollah is now the same, isn't it? That you sort of, when you speak about Hamas and when you speak about Hezbollah, you have to speak about them in a completely different way to the IDF because there are legal ramifications. I think that's wrong. I should say, I don't know why this man was arrested. I don't know, if it has anything to do with Hamas, but lots of these cases seem to be the state saying, we suspect you of glorifying terrorism. And when they say glorifying terrorism, they mean saying something in favor of the Palestinian militant resistance. And to me, that shouldn't be. It shouldn't be courts that decide whether that's right or wrong. That should be a matter for sort of public debate. Obviously, if it's like ISIS and it's an organization that's sort of functioning within the UK, then obviously membership of ISIS or membership of Al Qaeda should be, punishable. But expressing support for a resistance movement elsewhere, whose actions we may or may not agree with, seems wrong to me. Helena, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
I mean, what I would say is that's why the difference comes in, right? Where you can express the right of people to resist occupation whilst condemning acts they do that are violations of international law. Like, it's very easy to say, well, it's absolutely reasonable for Palestinian resistance groups to attack the military wings that are, again, engaging in a military occupation, a belligerent occupation of your territory. That is their right under international law, and you can say that whether or not you think that is justified, but you can't justify acts of terror against civilians. Like, these are things that you can absolutely. These are some really easy distinctions to make. But within Western canon, within Western discussion of these things, we never talk about the fact that there is a belligerent occupation, there is a military occupation, and there is justification in engaging in military targets. We never talk about this. So to the point where on the piece before, you would see all of the journalists in this country, a lot of the news organizations were describing the release of Israeli hostages from Gaza. Well, these people weren't hostages that were released. These were prisoners of war. They were soldiers who were captured from military bases. Like, they're not hostages, they're prisoners of war. Whilst there were civilian hostages, and obviously that's a war crime and should be roundly condemned by everybody, but prisoners of war are not hostages. These are two separate things. And yet you talk about Palestinian captives with prisoners when there's been no trial, there's been no due process, no charge. They've just been black bagged off the streets by an occupying military force for being for the crime of being the wrong ethnicity, potentially. I don't know. And then they get described as prisoners being released in a swap, and yet military prisoners of war get described as hostages who've been freed by an agreement through the ceasefire. Yeah, this is the two sides reporting together, or two-tier reporting and two-tier discussion of the Israel-Palestine conflict that you see, which isn't based in international norms. And this is where the liberal democratic order will break down, is if we only apply the rules to other people and we apply the freedoms to our friends.
I've just got an update on our middle story. I said Nvidia was down $460 billion. It's now down $600 billion in value, down almost 20%, which makes it by far the largest fall in value of a company ever in a single day. So that is really, really quite remarkable. And, I've seen lots of sort of takes online of people saying, that people are reading too much into this to get sort of the really transformational consequences of AI. You will need the kind of investment in chips that only OpenAI or Google can afford, and which only they can access because of the export controls on China. But clearly, investors think something very serious is going on if $600 billion have been wiped off the value of NVIDIA. Let's wrap up there. Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Absolutely a pleasure. Glad to fill in on Monday, and I look forward to next time.
And thank you all for watching. Come back tomorrow at 6 p.m. for another episode. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.